Here we have Chase Oliver running for president of the United States as the Libertarian Party candidate. When I first met Chase Oliver, it was at a very pleasant fundraiser soiree between drinks of gin and tonic, cherry Coke and Aperol. And he told me that he traces his political awakening back to when he started out as a police accountability and what he calls an anti-Bush war activist. He is not a leftist at all. He's very libertarian, but he describes himself as a pop culture libertarian who sees libertarian themes in TV shows, movies, and he works in the international restaurant business, getting his start as a dishwasher. We're going to dive into all of this and more. Mr. Oliver, it is an honor to have you on the show. Sadly, Matt couldn't make it today, but I want to credit him with doing lots of research for this episode and the topics we're going to discuss. But first off, give us an update on how the campaign is going.
Well, it's great to see you again. And yeah, I'm sorry your co-host isn't here, but it was great seeing him at that same event. And thank him for doing some research here. But the campaign is going great. We're actually about to be heading ourselves to Washington, D.C. We'll be in the morning. We'll be at the Georgia Secretary of State's office to officially file and get my electors placed. And then I'm on a plane to D.C. to participate in the debate hosted by Zero Hedge on immigration. Robbie Soave from Reason Magazine and The Hill will be partnering with me as we debate two other folks who are anti-immigration, and it'll be a great time. So, and then we'll cap off the end of the week with a fundraiser in Houston and participating in Houston Pride, which is one of the largest Pride festivals in the nation, and that'll be happening right over Stonewall weekend. And so the campaign has tons and tons of stuff going on, and I encourage people to follow the campaign. And when you're in neck of the woods, we'd love to see you. But it was great seeing you guys in North Carolina. That was a real fun event.
It was a really good event. Chase, one of the things that stuck out to me and got me excited to talk about is that you mentioned that the leftists view you as like their least hated libertarian or their favorite libertarian, because in terms of police accountability and anti-war activism, those positions actually align with a lot of progressives. And so my question is, how much across the aisle support are you getting from both sides, from conservatives and from progressives?
Well, I do believe in working within single issue coalitions. And so as I've been an activist in the anti-war space, and the police accountability space, you meet a lot of people across the political spectrum from left to right, from people who are libertarians like myself, who might be considered right of center, all the way to people who are like hardcore socialists, who are very left of center. I believe I've earned the respect of many of those people just for the fact that I show up, that I participate in the process, that I go to city council meetings and speak out against, say, Cop City in Atlanta, or that I've been, actually in the streets protesting war, even back when I was like 18 and 19 years old. I don't know if that translates to votes necessarily, but what it does is it at least opens minds up to look at our policies, to take an honest look at us. And providing that extra choice, for voters is a really good thing. I mean, even back to the Stop Cop City movement, as a libertarian reaching out across the aisle, it allows us to say that, this just isn't a left versus right thing. It's a right versus wrong thing when we talk about some issues. And I think that's a great space for libertarians to be in. A lot of times we're seen as the adults in the room, that if we're on, one side of the issue or the other, they can't say, well, this is just a Republican thing. Well, no, it's a Republican and a libertarian thing. Or, well, this is just a Democrat thing. Well, no, this is a Democrat or a left and libertarian thing. And so I look to, as an activist, to try to make as many relationships as I can along those single issue coalitions. So that way, win or lose an election day, we form stronger coalitions to fight in the streets with regards to activism. So I love doing that stuff.
I see. This wasn't the order I planned to discuss this topic, but since we're on the topic of police accountability, I want to ask a question from my friend, the law student Tyson Walter. And he was really curious about your opposition to qualified immunity, because as he views it, qualified immunity is a pretty common sense policy to protect government agents or officials from lawsuits and liability if something goes wrong. And given that policing is an extremely risky profession, if qualified immunity was removed, he stated that the police might be much more open to having lawsuits brought against them. So the classic rationale is that police should not have to worry about certain extraneous actions when pursuing a perpetrator for fear of lawsuit or liability for property damage. Can you expound on whether you agree with this narrative or not? Because I think this is a topic that, to be honest, I don't know much about, but I was very curious about it when I first read about it.
Yeah, so I think it's important to first know that qualified immunity is something that was never legislated or created by an executive order. It was created by judicial act, basically judicial activism from the bench. It kind of created this doctrine whole cloth that said that, if you think that you're following the Constitution, even if you're not, you can be protected from civil litigation. And this has allowed, people to get away with lots of stuff. Also, you know, just on the very nature of it, I find it to be unequal justice because, any other person, what they say is ignorance isn't an excuse for violating the law. And so just because you think that you were acting constitutionally and you ended up not being, that shouldn't shield you from prosecution. In fact, this should be informing us to have more constitutionally protected procedures for our police, have more accountability. And frankly, I think this makes for more community trust with police officers that if you're done wrong, you can seek recompense in court. I do understand there's dangers to policing, but if we actually look at the deaths per capita for industries, policing is not at the top. In fact, there's many industries that are ahead of that, including like being a lumberjack is more dangerous to your life potentially than being a police officer.
I
But they
see.
don't have legal protections that say, well, they have an extra doctrine that allows them to be immune from civil prosecution if they do something wrong, if they drop a tree on somebody's house and it kills somebody, right? And so I understand that there's a nature to protect police officers, but the best way to do this is to end the doctrine of qualified immunity and actually require that officers hold liability insurance policies. The reason why you want to do this is because A, people should be able to seek their day in court if they're done wrong. Just because you wear a badge shouldn't shield you from that. And honestly, you should be having to think about the constitutional outcomes and the civil outcomes if you're doing something wrong. This should be something
Hmm.
that motivates police officers to do better. Now, why do I want liability policies, liability insurance policies for police? Because when they are done wrong, I don't want these jury settlements to be coming out of the other city functions, things like roads or fire departments or schools or whatever that exist that a local government decides they want to spend money on. We shouldn't just be having, all of a sudden holes being blown into budgets of cities because police officers acted badly. Also, when you have these liability policies, it's a free market mechanism to get bad cops off the streets. So if you do wrong too many times and you cause settlements to have to occur, well, guess what? When you go to apply to be an officer in another department, they're going to say, "Hey, man, you're actually uninsurable." That follows you from department to department. We can't just like
Uh,
shuffle bad cops from place to place. And so this will just tell departments, "Hey, man, you're uninsurable. You're past our cap of what we can spend insuring our officers." And so you need to find another industry to work in. And so this isn't about backing the blue. This takes all the politics out of it, makes it strictly a business decision. And I
yeah.
think this is a great way to hold officers liable for when they do wrong, but also create a free market mechanism to get bad officers off the streets. These two things combined will create more community trust between people and law enforcement officers. And so when they see a crime being done, they're actually more likely to go seek the police as opposed to running from them, fearing violence or undue abuse. And so this will actually strengthen what it means to be a police officer and make their job easier.
I mean, one of the things that's shocking to me about policing in the United States, there was a recent case in Florida where the police officers were sent to the wrong person's home, and somebody is simply carrying a gun for self-defense. He has his hands up like this, and then the police officer immediately and aggressively opens the door, shoots the man, and then says, "Drop the gun," after shooting him. And it seems like the US has so many cases where police can instill more fear and actually, in extreme case, I mean, in cases where they lead to mass protests, like in Seattle, right? When in cases of extreme misconduct, there's a significant amount of people in the US who think that something needs to be done to radically reform or even abolish the police. And so my question is, how can policing in America have gone so awry compared to policing in Europe, where these sorts of cases are much more rare? What is the real deeper issue that drives you to be a police accountability activist?
Yeah, and I do want to also preface this with if you don't want to take my word for it about police accountability, take my running mate's word for it, Mike Termott. He actually served 10 years as a police officer, and on this issue, we are like there's no difference between our policies. In fact, you could read our platforms before we became running mates and see very little daylight between us. So don't just take my word for it; take a former police officer's word for it. But one of the things that would solve a lot of what we're seeing is the overcriminalization of our society. The fact that so many things are against the law that require a police officer's badge and bullet to be backing it up. And I think that's a great way to start seeing violence from police removed from our communities, ending things like the war on drugs. That has only basically created a black market for cartels to profit. It has created violence in our neighborhoods and has created an increased police presence where there doesn't really need to be. That if we removed the illegality of drugs, just like we did with prohibition. Like when we made alcohol legal, it created the entire modern day mafia. It created the Al Capone and all the violence that came from that. We're seeing that in real time in our current drug war. It does things like sex work illegal between consenting adults. I've always laughed that prostitution is illegal, but as soon as you put a film camera behind it and you make it into a movie, well, all of a sudden it's entertainment and now it's legal. We should remove things like sex work crimes because legal consenting sex work between adults should be the norm. We should quit filling our jail cells with people who are committing victimless crimes where there's no noticeable victim, like petty drug use, basic drug use.
Yes.
And we should retain those jail cells and those jail beds for people committing real crimes, force, fraud, coercion, theft, violence, where there is an actionable victim. And I think we kind of realigned our law enforcement priorities towards those crimes as opposed to the other crimes, overcriminalization, victimless crimes. We would see both reduction in crime rates because more people would just be able to legally do what they want to do, as well as safer communities.
This one of the things in my background is I was a research fellow for a harm reduction organization called Sea Change and Sea Change Community Organization and the Sea Change National Coalition based in New Jersey. And this is a question from someone from that organization, Alyssa. Given that the war on drugs has failed, I mean, why do politicians still believe that criminalizing every new drug that hits the streets is ever going to end the overdose crisis? And I wonder if it's a matter of perverse incentive of if this policy actually benefits someone. For example, is it the unions who want to keep criminalizing drugs, the police unions that is it the industry actors who make profit from this, or is it something more perverse, like just wanting to keep those people off the labor force, wanting to have less people to compete against when you're going for a job, if you know what I mean? Because it's so disturbing that I've talked to homeless people and they tell me, like, if you have a conviction and you're not from a family that can pick you back up or you don't have the connections, then that can really be the end of your working career.
Yep. And you're right. There's a lot of people who have incentives at play to keep that human misery going, that cycle of poverty, that cycle of trauma that we see in communities all over this country. And you're right. There is incentive from police unions because they get more funding, they get more notoriety. The back the blue no matter who kind of mentality has people in our legislatures and state houses and in Congress wanting to increase their funding because they see, hey, if we're backing the police officers, we're fighting for good. And I think we need to realign our priorities there. And as well as the private prison industry. It may sound weird for a libertarian to say this, but I oppose privatization of prisons. I support privatization of a lot of things. I think government shouldn't do many things that the private market could do far better. But I do believe that law enforcement and enforcing civil, law enforcement to correct violations of civil liberties is a function of the state that should not be passed on to private actors who have a profit motive to fill up prison cells and prison beds. When we do that, we create lobbying for overcriminalization, for mandatory minimum laws, for increased punishment, and that does not solve the issue. It just creates more trauma. And you're right. It is hard for people who have a record to ever get that start. And so I am somebody who does support both that criminal justice reform. And you mentioned harm reduction. I'm a huge fan of harm reduction because that is a much better way to allocate resources to actually help people who are in need, as opposed to washing it through government programs full of bureaucracy. I would
Yeah.
say I'd rather that money go directly to those who can help people who are passing out Narcan to prevent overdoses, people who are passing out fentanyl testing strips. So you can know that if the drugs you're taking are spiked with fentanyl that could kill you. I think we need to expand that to ending the drug war overall, so that if you have a drug in your hand, you can take it to a pharmacy and you can have it tested, because much of the overdoses we're seeing are not people who are meaning to take fentanyl. It's people who think they're taking a Xanax or heroin or something else that's been spiked with fentanyl and it's killing them. And so for me, we have to have more empathy for these people. Because you're right, just one infraction could ruin your life. It could ruin your ability to ever get your start, to get your hand up, to get your help in the economy. And so, if we're really serious about addressing addiction, helping people get a start, and not just throwing money at them or pity at them, but actually saying, "Here's a way that you can have a path to success in your life again," we need to embrace a way different way of looking at these issues.
The thing you said about money being washed through federal bureaucracies absolutely hits home when it comes to the addiction epidemic. Because what I learned being part of that organization was that oftentimes when the way that these grants are distributed is very opaque, and the people who sit on the councils to vote for where, for example, where opiate settlement funds go, are often the owners of the very hospitals and the very rehab programs, and they vote for the money to go to their own organizations in a way that's purely conflict of interests. And so this leads me to the question, in this age where corporations and the well-connected send lobbyists to Washington, and in turn, politicians and bureaucrats are expected to sponsor businesses through subsidies, grants, and contracts, and sponsor organizations through subsidies, grants, and contracts, whether it's for a good cause, like addiction treatment or not. But the question is, will that money actually be used accountably? Like, how can we keep corporations accountable for their decisions in a time when, to me at least, it seems like business and government are becoming increasingly intertwined and hard to tell apart?
Yeah, I think it comes with kind of changing our mindset and insisting that citizens be a little bit more active and insisting on some real changes at this level. First off, if I could wave a magic wand, I would remove all subsidies and deductions from all businesses altogether and just lower the overall cost of doing business by flattening the corporate tax code. So that way, whether you're a small business, a medium business, or a large business, you're competing on the same level, and you're not getting giveaways that are only existing for those who can afford fancy tax attorneys and accountants, as opposed to that mom and pop business who's just trying to start their first sole proprietorship or their first partnership and really get started in the marketplace. Because small business does drive the engine of the economy. It's where most businesses actually hire people. It's where most people work, is for small businesses. Of course, the profits are all driven to the large businesses, and this is because they've bought and paid for all the carve-out subsidies and deductions. And this leads to where we don't have a true free, a corporate cronyist market. And so, as a libertarian, I would seek to remove that influence altogether, so that it's easier to start a business, easier to run a business, and easier to actually compete. And it does come with us untying the knot that is the corporate control over our legislatures. This is why it's important to have libertarians and other parties to actually speak out and be competition for the two-party system. Now, when it comes to federal grants and contracts, there's always going to be instances where there's a need for the government to contract out, services or goods in the private marketplace, which is certainly better than creating a federal bureaucratic workforce that would have to do those things. And we do that efficiently with ending no bid contracts, having full transparency so the American public can see what's going on, and of course being able to easily tie who was awarded contracts and who has lobbied them. Who has paid for these people. As long as lobbying exists, we need to actually have as much transparency as possible. This is one of the reasons why, contrary to many people, I say remove the deduction or remove the caps on political contributions, but also just outlaw super PACs altogether. Just say, hey, if you want to support somebody, support it, be transparent. So that way we know who's buying and paying for our politicians, as opposed to this dark money atmosphere that we have, where we have these large super PACs who don't coordinate with the main campaigns. I think that's a much better way to do this. So increase transparency for who's buying our politicians, remove the impact altogether by having transparent and ending no bid contracts. And in the long run, let's try to get rid of all those carve-outs and deductions altogether and just lower the cost of doing business so we have a true free market.
I'm curious, are there ever cases where higher tax rates, like tax brackets, actually benefit the more established businesses? Because I wonder if that's ever used as a tool to stop new competitors from coming in, is lobbying for higher taxes.
Oh, absolutely. So if you set a tax rate, say at like 20, I'm just pulling numbers out. Like if you have a tax rate of 15%, right?
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be what it's across the board, but of course you're now a big business who can go in and lobby to Congress people and say, "Hey, we need deductions for this. We need deductions for that. We need deductions for this." Well, that small mom and pop business who can't afford the tax attorney and the accountant, they're just going to pay that base rate of 15%. But those big businesses who have now lobbied Congress, well, now their rate's effectively down to 10% or 9%. Well, it becomes harder for a small business to grow and compete in this climate. And what this does is kind of solidifies power at the top, and it kind of solidifies the inefficiency and bureaucracy that is central planning. And it's kind of a corporate it's kind of this marriage between corporate power and bureaucracy, which is not it's not healthy for the economy in the long run. It's not healthy for a marketplace for innovation, and it's not healthy for job growth and in creating new businesses and new jobs. So ultimately, it only benefits those who are in Washington, D.C. or in your state house and those big businesses that lobby them. So yeah, it's an unholy marriage.
Hmm. You mentioned this word central planning, and it's interesting you mentioned that because since this is also a philosophy podcast, I want to pivot and ask a more abstract question about the book Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the book Road to Serfdom by Frederick Hayek. And he argued that at the core of every sort of economic idea or political thought philosophy or worldview about how policies should be made that relies on planning rather than markets, that planning comes with the tendency to diminish the individual rights. And when unchecked, this blossoms into authoritarianism or worse. And now this is a very intellectual argument because he argues that it happens in stages. First, there's the good intention of wanting to help people. And then when there's disagreement over what the plans actually are going to be made for, then this leads to the worst people to get on top and to actually dictate the system. I wonder if you have any particular insight on seeing this like in the real world, where the planning that is actually meant to help the small guys might help the more established, other than taxes, other
Well,
than.
yeah, I mean, what they say is absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the further we centralize power, the more there is the tendency for us to basically, screw over the little guy, to coalesce power for the benefit of the few and not for the many. You do see this in instances in government all the time. Just look at our military industrial complex, the fact that we export bombs and drones and technology around the world. That might not necessarily be the best thing for us to be doing as a nation, but we do it because why? Well, those military components and parts are they're built in congressional districts all over the country. And so, well, if we say no to this new plane or this new tank or this new technology, well, all of a sudden, well, that costs you hundreds of jobs in your district. Well, now it affects you. And it might not be in the best interest of your constituents, but
Right.
now it's certainly in the best interest of the people who are lining your pockets with campaign donations in the military industrial complex. And you get immense pressure from all of your colleagues who are
Hmm.
now all of a sudden screaming about how it's going to cost them their jobs in their districts.
Hmm.
And so having this kind of centralized planning, absolutely, there are instances where these central planners are benefiting for themselves and for those who are lining their pockets, and not necessarily for the people who elected them into power. And due to gerrymandering and ballot access, it and the power of incumbency, it becomes easier and easier over time to have that happen in Washington, D.C. And so it is absolutely a corrupting factor. And it's why we libertarians support a decentralized marketplace to the most local governance as possible. And that would be self-governance at the lowest level. At the most local level is you being able to govern your own behavior. And if you're not violating anybody's civil liberty, that's where it should stop. And that's very in stark contrast to, say, those who advocate for central planning, the Marxists and the socialists of the world, who think that government needs to have a heavy hand there.
So, in my opinion, what we've seen notably in 2008, but even before that, and once again in the pandemic, is the beginning of a cycle where governments, um, particularly our government, respond to fragility in the banking system by taking on larger roles to support capital markets and enabling the US to issue more debt. And I'm talking about the Federal Reserve System. There's massive, sophisticated new liquidity creation since the pandemic, underwriting or holding corporate bonds as well as traditional assets. And when Silicon Valley Bank failed, there was talk about expanding FDIC insurance. And I think that these responses are costly in ways that are not always immediately clear. And for that reason, I tend to be sort of anti-Federal Reserve. I was always sort of the stubborn semi-Austrian in my economics class. And however, I spoke with my friend who is a wealth advisor and an economist who explained to me that the Federal Reserve is still needed to support the strength of the dollar with the open market operations, with controlling the demand for bonds. And I know another financial professional who argued that the US is a monetary sovereign. So much of what conventional economics believes about the danger of debt is untrue. Where do you stand on this issue of the relationship between the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the capital markets of the US? What should be the role of the government and central banks, if there should be a role at all?
Yeah. So first off, you said you were a semi-Austrian economist. If you want to speak to a full-fledged Austrian economist, talk to my vice president or running mate, Mike Termott. He actually taught economics. He could probably go more in depth than I could on this. I'll be frank. But when it comes to, the relationship between banks, the Federal Reserve, our monetary policy, the first thing we see is that banks get bailed out before any individual does. We pump capital into banks who then loan that money out with interest to individuals who really need help, and we need credit and they need liquidity. And so it really benefits the banks when, people are kind of paying that interest. But what I would like to see ultimately is if a bank is on the brink of failure, for it to fail, it needs to fall apart, and it needs to have its assets liquidated and broken into smaller pieces and then absorbed by other actors in the marketplace who can then reallocate those resources and better utilize them. It's basic economics. And that's what we continue to not do as a country. And what we're doing is we create this bubble burst cycle that really doesn't benefit the average American. It does benefit the banks who get bailed out. But what it does to us is it devalues our currency. So it makes the average person who's living paycheck to paycheck having to stretch further and further. And so there's the real economic harm that's supposedly not felt is actually felt by the average working person. And they say, well, look, the stock market's up. Well, that's great for those who have a retirement account and for those who are trading in stocks. But for the average working person who's living paycheck to paycheck, all they see is that, less things are going in their grocery cart every time when they go to the grocery store. Now, our relationship with the Fed, I'm an in the Fed guy. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to audit the Fed. So that way the American people, our Congress, have oversight over what goes on at the Fed. But I think ideally, once people see what's going on and the manipulation of the marketplace that's happening at the Fed, we would want to end it overall. I think we need to return our monetary policy back to being backed by something that's finite, whether it's gold or silver or saffron or whatever. Pick your resource that's finite, that has a price built into it, and let's peg the dollar there. That keeps us from having these inflationary bubble burst cycles that we continue to see. We can still have steady market growth. We can still have a strong dollar. But that would also require us to stop spending trillions of dollars that we don't have every year and printing that on the digital printing press and devaluing each of our money. So from a base level, from just the base person who's living in the economy, this practice harms us for the average working Joe. On the macroeconomic level, like I said, Mike could probably talk to you for an hour just about the details and intricacies of that. But what I see is I see the large people getting bailed out. I see the large firms profiting, and I see the average guy getting screwed. And I think more Americans are feeling that now more than ever, certainly since the post-pandemic inflationary crunch.
Right. I think the money we have today is not the money that the Americans before 1900 had. And that sounds very strange, but I had a mentor who told me that our monetary system is debt-based money. And the way he explained it was, rather than $1 being $1, $1 is that $1 that was extended into the economy through a bank deciding to issue a loan with a fractional reserve base that it got a loan from another bank, with that bank getting its loan from the Federal Reserve, which then sets the interest rates. And so the downfall that I did not realize could take place at the beginning of my studies in economics was that the multiplier effect people talk about also happens in reverse, because compounding down also happens. And the rationale that's given to us about the banks failing in 2008 and why that needed liquidity injections was because if one bank can't pay back its loan, then the bank that extended credit to that bank can't pay back its loan, and then the whole credit system falls down. And so, in terms of pegging the currency so there's not unlimited creation, I absolutely agree with. However, in my view, there's many moral decisions and economic decisions that depend upon the trust we have with others who are playing the game, right? So, for example, in trade, Donald Trump pointed out that the U.S. manufacturers struggled when competing against China because China devalues its currency and subsidized exports. And it's actually the same situation, arguably the same situation with monetary policy. And so many libertarians like yourself argue that the market should choose the interest rate. But my question is, how can we actually liberalize when other countries set their interest rates artificially low? I mean, couldn't that cause the other countries to take advantage of us by setting their interest rates super low and then sucking up US capital? That's
So in the
the,
short term, there can be some disruption from that, right?
yes.
But I think what we need to do is we need to avoid engaging in trade wars where we start to tariff imports that make the cost of living higher in the United States for firms who buy foreign goods, and that's eventually you and me who buy things on the grocery store shelves or at Walmart. So we need to avoid the temptation to engage in trade wars. I think what we need to do is continue to let China do what it's doing, call them on their bluff, continue free trade, and engage in the marketplace. And what you're going to see is China will create this giant balloon that will eventually burst. And when it does, you're going to see an economic crisis happening in China. And overall, what you're going to see is market liberalization happening out of that because people are going to say, hey, the government set all these rates, they devalued the currency, they did all these things, and it led to calamity. And so I think we have to let them fail. Like we have to let the Chinese marketplace go through this disruption that it's heading towards. Like, I mean, it is just like a train heading to the station, man. It is going right towards an economic crisis. And we do need to allow that to happen so they can learn what happens when you try to manipulate the marketplace the way they have. It will create market harms. Trust me, people will lose prosperity in China because of this. But I'm hoping what we see in the response is a walk away from state central planning, a walk away from the way China has operated in terms of more market liberalization, which we've seen from China over the last, since the revolution of Mao, we have seen further and further walks. Maybe sometimes it's one step, maybe sometimes it's a quick jaunt or a trot towards market liberalization. And the last time we had that great jump forward was in the 90s. And I think it's due time for us to be seeing that again in the 2025, and ahead. So I think for me, the best thing we can do is continue to let China burn itself out. And when it eventually does, try to embrace and invest and inject our capital into China, right, as they're going to have to be rebuilding because they're going to need capital from somebody. And well, guess who's the largest economy in the world who can help bail them out when they need it and help inject capital into their country and further create a market relationship. So maybe we're not militarily opposing each other. Let's further ingrain our market relationship so that we're not wanting to attack each other or go to war over Taiwan.
That's interesting that you mentioned that the tariffs also hurt manufacturing. And so it seems like Donald Trump was only portraying the situation in one way, where he was thinking about not thinking about the input costs as well as competing in sales. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and what's funny is Joe Biden ran against those policies, and in the last year, he's now doubled or tripled down on many of these tariffs. So, he said that it was economically irresponsible. It was bad for us to be doing this. But now, of course, now that he's trying to earn votes, he's doing that.
My next question on economics is, and also on China, is what are your thoughts on BRICS and other multi-nation coalitions and other organizations that aim to develop alternatives to the US-led economic order? I don't know if being a libertarian would give you any particular stance on it, but just what do you know about it that's relevant for running for president?
Yeah, just kind of bird's eye view of the whole thing. I think the fact that we even have this coming up, that BRICS is even a topic of discussion, is an indicator that we are actually weakening our position with the dollar based on our fiat currency model, where we're just kind of printing money out of thin air and just de facto devaluing and inflating the dollar. So the fact that we're even having to have that discussion shows that the United States is weakening its position economically around the world based on the actions they've taken. And I think this has really started, as you mentioned earlier, really since 2008, and then has continued to ramp up since then. Um, but yeah, for me, it is a warning sign that we actually need to change our monetary policy and change course, lest we run into more and more competing currencies and competing interests like BRICS. And I'm happy to see folks like Argentina with its newly elected libertarian candidate or newly elected libertarian president, however, embracing the dollar as opposed to BRICS, which he, based on the relationship with Brazil and others, could have been very tempting. So I'm happy to see that more and more people are seeing a value in the dollar. And ultimately, if we stop printing trillions out of thin air, BRICS won't be something we have to worry about long term.
My last question about economics and finance to you is actually about your personal financial planning. And I want to ask, what does financial freedom look like for you? What does it feel like? And do you actually think that you will retire someday, given that more and more people feel that that's actually a goal that's out of reach due to all the problems we discussed?
Well, I'll just start answering backwards from there. I hope I get a chance to retire. Like, I hope we have an economy that allows me to retire. I'm planning for that. It's crazy enough that I'm running for president young enough where I think I can actually recoup the savings that I'm losing by, using my savings to live to run for president. So I'm going to be basically starting from scratch again after this process. Other than my retirement account, my pension, and my 401k that I have that I earned working. But when it comes to personal savings, I'm going to be pretty stretched thin after November. But because I'm under the age of 40, I think I have time to recoup those savings and to recoup my spot in the marketplace to where I can retire one day. I've probably added a few years to my working life just taking a year and a half off running for president.
That's
But that's the sacrifice I want to make. So yes, I do believe I'm going to have a chance to retire. And personally, I'm stretching myself very thin right now, but that's because I think I am at an age to where I'm going to be able to recoup those losses. I don't think I would be doing this if I was 65 or 70, based on my working career, because unlike a lot of people in politics, I'm not somebody who came from a place of privilege or a place of wealth.
right.
I've been a working adult my entire life. And even running for president, which doesn't really draw a salary, allows you to you know to work hard, even if I'm not really contributing to my retirement right now. I'm probably taking years off my life, so there's that, right? The stress of running for president makes it where I don't need as much time to retire because I'm taking years off my life.
Yeah, that is hilarious. Now I need to pivot to discuss more of core philosophical issues and more core philosophical beliefs that you have. So you've said that you truly embrace classical liberalism. And I wonder if most people know what that means or um, have an idea in their head of what it means that's inaccurate. So I want to ask you, are there any deep intellectual or academic thinkers who've informed the classic liberal worldview you hold? And first of all, what is classical liberalism? To answer the first part of the question. I don't know if
So
people,
broadly speaking, classical liberalism is the school of thought that says that the purpose of government, if it is to exist, should be to defend the civil liberties and rights of all people. It implies that liberty and your inherent human rights are not dependent upon where you were born or where you've come from. It is something that is inherent to you as a human being. Because of that, it is a philosophy that spreads across political borders. It's one that says that our world should be cosmopolitan and diverse in its viewpoint. It was born out of the Enlightenment. Many of the founding fathers who created this nation, however imperfect it was from the outset due to things like slavery and other things, and lack of women's suffrage and lack of visibility for many people, the ideals that this nation was founded upon are classically liberal in their and more we're trying to perfect the application of classical liberal values by expanding those rights to by ending slavery, by giving women the right to vote, by allowing people to marry who they want to marry and love who they want to love. These kinds of things are actually expanding upon the classical liberal traditions that founded this nation. And of course, if you go back and read many of the writings of our founding fathers, you're going to see that strain uh, following through. Now, I think if you want to look at a modern classical liberal writer and thinker, and I think probably the best introduction to that, as well as into libertarianism, that would be David Bose. Recently passed away. He was the vice president of the Cato Institute for many years. And he is somebody that if you want a great primer into libertarianism and classical liberal theory, The Libertarian Mind is probably the best book for somebody who needs an introduction into that branch and that wing of libertarianism, the classical liberal side of things. And I think that book is a brilliant, brilliant tome for people to read. And so that's probably, if I was to say who gave me my biggest underpinnings philosophically in terms of libertarianism, it would be David Bose. It would be Milton Friedman in terms of the economic side of things. And then really a great candidate that we had for president was Harry Brown. So like those are probably the three biggest philosophical underpinnings of course, other than say the classics, people like Hayek and people like if you want to go back to Smith and Locke and just all the way back to the real old school stuff. But modern application of classical liberal thought, I think, can be no better translated than through someone like David Bose, and may he rest in peace.
I have not read any of David Bowe's work. I read part of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and I think that was a really fascinating book because what he wrote that stuck with me from that book was that in socialist societies, there's no elites who support capitalism. There's no people in the government who support capitalism because everything is interconnected. However, in capitalist societies, he wrote, there are still elites who support socialism because you can find a singular person who will contract with other individuals to support socialism. And so, in an ironic way, classical liberalism proves itself by allowing the opposition to voice their opposition. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, one of the things they always say is, you can be a socialist in a capitalistic society, but you can't be a capitalist in a socialist society. You can form worker co-ops right now in this nation, like where the workers control the means of the production, right? They control the company through a co-op. Those can exist right now in a free marketplace. But if this were a socialist society, to have a capitalistic business would be outlawed. It would be forbidden. And so I think it's brilliant there from Friedman. And, Free to Choose is a television program that existed before you were born, probably before I was born, actually. It was the early 80s. But I think it's one of the most brilliant applications of like libertarian thinking. And ironically, it was on public television, which is just this weird kind of irony there. I think
Okay.
it's on Amazon Prime right now if you want to check it out. But I think it's high time that somebody kind of updates that television series for the 2020, for the 2020s. And I think if we did, we'd see a lot more people waking up to the ideas of libertarian marketplace economics.
Okay. Speaking of television, you told me that the way you communicate your ideas is by being, if I remember what you said, like a pop culture libertarian. And you told me that shows like South Park, in particular, are really good at conveying libertarian ideas. And then I guess maybe I don't watch a lot of TV. Like I've never really watched South Park. But my question is there something about pop culture that is distinctly libertarian? Because I could see you take that logic and use it for other ideologies. For example, you could be a pop culture conservative, or
Hmm.
you could be a pop culture socialist. I guess King of the Hill would be like the pop culture conservative, and there's probably a lot of shows that are pop culture Marxist. But what do you see about libertarianism and pop culture? That actually really surprised me to.
Well, the reason why I describe myself as in one way as a pop culture libertarian is because I think sometimes art and culture is actually the best way to export our values in a way that resonates with people. I use South Park as an example because Trey Parker and Matt Stone are huge libertarians in terms of this free speech,
Oh, okay.
and their ability to kind of say whatever they want to say. They take no prisoners. They don't really they skew everybody. They satirize everyone. And because of this, it shows like the broad range of free speech. In fact, some celebrities have gotten hyper offended and have even threatened to sue. And like, they're not afraid to do these things. And so I've always found, inspiration in those guys. But really, where a lot of the pop culture libertarianism, I think, comes from is from the hero's journey that we see in many pieces of art. A big one is, Star Wars. If I ask a room full of people, just regular people, hey, how many of you have read Mises or Hayek or Milton Friedman.
Well, I guess I'm the weirdo who's actually read more of that than
Right?
Steve.
Your hand would
Yeah,
go up, but not many would, right? But if you go
right.
into a room and you say, okay, who here has watched Star Wars? Like nearly everyone's hand is going to go up, right? It's just part of the culture. And that is a story of essentially a farm kid who fights an authoritarian empire with the help of a smuggler and his buddy. Like that is, ultimately a libertarian story about being opposed to an authoritarian empire. Even if you go background and like how, you even go into the prequel films, it's all about taxation of trade routes. And it was all started by, somebody who was manipulating the political scenes in the background to feign a war. He basically wagged the dog. And so there's lots of libertarian and anti-government themes if you look at who's the ultimate evil in the Star Wars universe, which is the Emperor he destroyed a republic and created an authoritarian empire. The Hunger Games. Great book. If you have if you have a kid who wants to get into libertarianism or you want to get them into libertarianism, have them read The Hunger Games. Like spoiler alert, in the third book, Katniss Everdeen shoots a heart right through the leader of the communist state and watches as the leader of the fascistic state gets torn to pieces by the citizenry. Right. So it is very anti-fascism and anti-communism. It is very much pro individual freedom and removing ourselves from the authoritarianism and the violence that it creates, to where literally in this world, the state is forcing children to fight each other to the death for the amusement of the political elite. And so I think there's so many libertarian themes throughout art that just are not pushed enough by us as libertarians to remind people that, hey, you cheer for libertarianism when it's in a book. You cheer for it when it's in a movie, when in a film or on TV. But when it comes to our lives, why are we always cheering for the empire? Why are we always cheering for the government structures that create more control in our lives and abuse more people? Shouldn't we be wanting to be the rebels, not just in Star Wars, but like in our own lives? And so I, as a libertarian, try to push those themes through to people who maybe don't think about it enough. They just kind of see the base level story. They're like, hey, man, we like watching Jedi Knights fight the Sith and we like watching space battles. Well, let's think a little bit deeper about the themes of our stories and how they might relate to our current government and how it's an authoritarian empire.
I read Hunger Games. I really liked reading the Hunger Games. I didn't like the movie because I think it's hard to bring a first person narrative story into a film, right? I mean, the Hunger Games is literally written as Katniss Everdeen's diary.
Mhm.
And I just don't remember the communist and fascist element to that. I guess maybe it flew over my head. I was too young when I read
Well,
it.
yeah, if you look at District 13, right? That's
Right.
definitely the communist state because they are all awarded, everyone gets their apportioned amount of food. They're living in their same size cube. Everyone is afforded the same thing. Now, it is done, what they say is for survival. We can't be having people, having more than other people because that'll create contention and we are all living underground and it'll tear down the social fabric. Well, the social fabric of District 13 is certainly communistic in its nature. And then the capital is an example of just the fascist authoritarian empire. It's like the basically the glorification of controlling individual industries, controlling these regions for the benefit of one centralized authority that glorifies itself via architecture and via myth and mythology and creating its own kind of. And it's very reminiscent of the fascistic states of the first half of the 20th century with Mussolini and Hitler, of like building themselves up through mythology of like, oh, this is the way it's always been, and this is what keeps us together. And so that kind of tradition there reads very fascistic to me. So like I see a lot of those themes, but you're right. Maybe the movie kind of glosses over them a little bit, and the book, maybe to me that maybe is a side theme that we don't push on enough. But
I guess that's kind of a strange interpretation because I don't remember anyone in District 13 being like adamantly in favor, like ideologically fervent or enthusiastic about the society they were living in because it was completely, if I remember correctly, imposed on them by the
yep.
capital. And so it's not really what you're saying, if I understand, it wasn't really fascist versus communist in the Hunger Games. It was a fascist state imposing communism on another.
Well, District 13 was actually, separated from the capital. They were this mystery District 13, and they were living underground. And so, yeah, they were basically forced by war to kind of hide. But their leader, Coin, was very much about, equality for everybody. Everyone is equal to the state. Of course, she's probably better fed than everybody else. She probably has a little bit of a leg up because she is the state and the authority, and that's much what we see in Marxism, right? Is hey, we're all equal comrades, except for those of us who sit on the Central Committee.
What about the obvious pop culture libertarian Ayn Rand? Have you read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead or any of her other?
I have, and I really wish the Atlas Shrugged films had been better than they were. I think, the first one they put a lot of money into it, and then it didn't really perform as well as they thought, and so then they kind of had to make the sequels to complete the story, and they kind of got lower and lower quality, unfortunately. Fountainhead's a really cool movie, but yeah, I've read Atlas Shrugged. It is a thick book to get through, and I can say, for me. That one is obviously hard to translate into a film as well. I think it has a lot of challenges. Ayn Rand's style, I just don't think translates as well as to the screen as maybe some others. But yeah, I recommend folks read her. Objectivism is a school of thought that I'm not 100% ascribed to. I do, but I do appreciate her contribution to the discussion. I think there's a lot of authors like that. Heinlein, the sci-fi author, man. If you just read a lot of his works, very libertarian in their themes as well.
Is it the Dune author?
No, that's Frank Herbert.
Yeah.
I'm also a huge fan of the Herbert novels as well. I think you can draw certainly not libertarian themes, but themes against the corruption of power and how, people who,
Okay.
they think they're doing right, but end up killing billions. But hey, we're doing the right thing because billions more if we don't. There's a lot of themes. Paul's not the hero. That's the biggest thing. If you're watching Dune right now and you think Paul is the hero after Dune 2, like I
Right.
don't know what to tell you.
Well, I guess my problem with Ayn Rand is that yeah, it's a hard style to translate, but I could continue Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged with her sort of same formula because her what surprised me about Atlas Shrugged is she had a more sophisticated understanding of corruption than I expected. Like there's one scene in which Dagny Taggart's incompetent brother, Jim Taggart, is talking about how he's going to set up a shell company and buy the shares, and then since he also sits on the government, that he's going to force the government to contract with his shell company. That surprised me. But and also the theme of love, romantic love being inherently selfish. I wrote an essay about that. Just pondering it over. But the rest of it is hard for me to get behind because I don't think Ayn Rand understands that there are limits to both the individual and limits in economics. I think Ayn Rand believes that if you took the most brilliant entrepreneurs and gave them all the wealth, that they could create economic growth that goes on forever. And I'm more of a zero-sum person. I don't think that just because you allocate things efficiently through a market, that necessarily means that the resources exist to keep going on forever. It was very strange to me reading Ayn Rand, but I don't know. We don't have to keep talking about Ayn Rand, but if you have
Yeah,
something,
well, I mean, I think you gave a great summary right there, and I
yeah.
think there's a lot of this is why I'm not an objectivist. This is why I'm not fully ascribed to the Ayn Rand school of thought. And you kind of hit the nail on the head there.
Okay. Talking about freedom of speech, however, is something I want to ask you about because when me and Matt started reading the book A Gold New Deal, edited by your vice presidential candidate, Mike Termat, the book begins by hinting that the government is really going down a dangerous route. It lists many examples of whistleblowers who were accosted, arrested, and silenced for expressing freedom of speech. For example, the African People's Socialist Party members who face 10 years in prison for allegedly acting as agents of Russia, Matt Taibbi, Julian Assange, Douglas Mackey, who was convicted by a federal jury when all he did was post jokes. Do you believe that the situation about freedom of speech is serious? I mean, going back to what you said about South Park, where the creators offended some people, that people tried to sue them. How can what is what in is this right of classical liberalism, the idea of freedom of speech being preserved, or is it being eroded in the current day?
Well, I think it is worrisome, and I do think there are instances where the freedom to express oneself is under threat. But when you mention whistleblowers, like that is a huge thing. That the fact that you have people who are exposing what the government does, and they're being made criminals because of this. To me, when they're doing it through, not to harm anybody, but to expose what's going on so that we're informed, that worries me. And it does worry me when we see things like, we're seeing more free speech being curtailed overseas, speech codes and things, places like Australia, the UK. I don't want to see those exported to the United States. Thank God we do have a clear constitutional protection of free speech. Doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people who try to pass things that are in clear violation of that. And that has to work its way through the courts. A lot of that is performative virtue signaling too. I really cannot stand when people pass a law or sign something into law. They just know that's going to get tossed out by the courts eventually, but they do it so they can run on it because that costs the state millions of dollars to have to defend it in court. I'm talking to you, Louisiana, with your 10 Commandments thing going on. And so to me, there can be nothing more important than freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech is the First Amendment for a reason. There's a reason why we put guns second, because they say the pen is mightier than the sword.
Right.
The ability to speak out and use your voice and express oneself is actually a stronger weapon than even physical arms,
Yeah.
if done correctly, because the power of peaceful nonviolent resistance is actually torn on authoritarianism and structures that are rooted in the monopoly of violence in the past. And so for me to defend this, there can be no greater thing. There can be no greater thing than to defend one's right to say something. Now, does that mean that we'll live in a world where people say things that I vehemently disagree with? Absolutely. Because the purpose of free speech is to defend controversial speech. If it was just speech I agreed with, and that was the only thing we need to defend, well, it wouldn't really be very free now, would it? And so, I understand that there's going to be controversial speech. There's going to be things that anger and rile up people and piss them off and say, oh, how dare they? And guess what? You're utilizing your free speech to express your outrage with that stuff. And I truly believe in a free marketplace of ideas. Tolerance and love and empathy will win out against those messages that are to the contrary. And so if we're going to be without fear, if we're going to be truly fighting for liberty, we have to fight for the liberty of those who we vehemently disagree with, and we have to recognize that it is our freedom to vehemently disagree with them. And so free speech is something that cannot be defended enough. It should be defended absolutely to every end.
One of the areas where I'm very worried that free speech is under attack is the ability of pro-Palestinian. That's a weird term to even use. You don't want Palestinians to die, so you're suddenly pro-Palestinian. But the proposed anti-Semitism bill, which would have sent anti-Semitism monitors to campuses to try and weed out whether support for Palestinian liberation somehow crosses the line into anti-Semitism. I mean, I believe you're the only candidate running, the major candidate running, who said that Israel needs to end the genocide with those words. Unless I'm mistaken, you're the only major candidate who has taken this stance. I myself am very supportive of a ceasefire. And so these two issues intertwine. One, how do we defend the right of freedom of speech when there's been this propaganda effort to label that speech as hateful, to label it as anti-Semitic? And how do we get across the urgency of saving Palestinian lives when so many politicians have a strong incentive to support Israel?
Yeah. So with regards to free speech, I mean, we're just looking at like even the TikTok ban. It seems crazy that all of a sudden, post October 7th, when you saw lots of pro-peace voices, pro-Palestinian voices, pro-ceasefire voices appearing on this platform that had so many young people tuned into it, that all of a sudden the United States government felt the need to regulate it. It seems very coincidental that happened that way. But when we look at the anti-Semitism bill, the best way to combat anti-Semitism is to have full amounts of free speech, to allow people to say what they're going to say, and then use your ability to speak out against them. I'm a pro-peace candidate. I'm calling out what's going on with the government of Israel, but I'm always quick to say that it's the government of Israel and not the people of Israel or the Jewish people, because I feel like I can be a pro-peace advocate without being anti-Semitic. I tell people all the time, if you can't be anti-war, but also, if you can't be anti-war without being anti-Semitic, you're not really worth my time and you're not really my ally, because you make it much harder for us to fight for peace when your first thing is to oppose Jews or to oppose Judaism. That is not helpful. That's not constructive. And it certainly discounts the Jewish voices who are calling out for peace as well. who are certainly not anti-Semitic themselves. And so, I think it's important for us to have free speech to allow people to say these things that might be terribly outrageous, but to recognize that if we're not calling it out as a pro-peace movement, we're doing a disservice ourselves to allow that speech to kind of go on unchallenged. It's beholden to us if we want to live in a place with free speech to challenge when we see anti-Semitism and not just pro-peace being spoken.
Okay,
But yeah,
but with this particular question, um, there's a lot of contention about what actually crosses the line into anti-Semitism, right? People will say that, well, if you're not a Zionist, then that's inherently anti-Semitic. As somebody who really likes to delve into history, I've always personally found it difficult to understand why reestablishing a kingdom that existed in ancient times is seen as a legitimate political goal. So if I were to go out and tell people that instead of supporting Israel, I'm organizing to reestablish the Outremer or the Crusader states, I wouldn't be taken seriously. I'd become the object of ridicule and parody. And looking into the actual history, the Ghassanid Arabs brought Arabian civilization and identity in the 8th century, and they adopted the more ancient-speaking Aramaic, Christian, and pagan populations into their society. And so that to me is the legitimate inherited. That society, the Arab Palestinian society, have a stronger historical claim to the land than Israel does. And so some people would take that comment that I made and say that that is anti-Semitic. And that's what I don't like about the anti-Semitism bill is it equates support for Palestine or saying controversial things is automatically hate speech. And I don't think that's true at all because I've thought about what I would do if I were a Jewish Zionist, if I were on the other side of things. So Jews have lived in regions all over the world for so long that they have indigenous languages to those regions of the world. For example, Ladino, which is a Sephardic Jewish language. To me, it makes more sense to say that Jews are indigenous to Spain. The Sephardic Jews are indigenous to Spain, for example. But I've noticed that this particular issue is so contentious that because of that stance I made, I think some people would say I'm anti-Semitic. What do you
yeah.
think?
Well, I do want to say this first off. Let me be maybe the first person to ever say that, the Middle East is complicated,
Right.
right? There's no simple black or white answer to much of these questions. There's going to be conflict and controversy. But we can't be afraid of those conversations. I also think what you just said is not anti-Semitic. You didn't, and I think there are people who are Jews who are non-Zionist. There are non-Zionist Jews in the world. I don't believe they're being anti-Semitic. They're not hating on themselves. And so I think it's important to recognize that there is a difference between having a difference of opinion on the state of Israel. It does not necessarily mean that you hate the Jewish people or the Jewish religion.
Mhm.
I don't think that those two things. Similarly, I think on the other side, there is plenty of people who have that hatred out there, and it's important for us to call that out and to recognize that that is not what we are, right? Like you and me, I'm assuming, right? And just based on the fact that you seem like a normal, decent human being, right? I don't feel like you're somebody who has hate filling their heart. And so I think it's important for us, though, as people who may have criticisms of the government of Israel, what the government of Israel does or how they interact with the Palestinian people, it's important for us to be able to call that out without being labeled as hate mongers. The same way as we should be able to call out the actions of Hamas and say that they're terrible without being seen as anti-Muslim, right? Oh, we don't hate the Muslim people for saying that terrorism is a bad thing and that the violence that was perpetrated on October 7th was a horrible thing and nothing we would want to see in our own neighborhoods. And so I think if we're going to be afforded that grace to say that what we just said there is not anti-Muslim, to call out the actions of the government of Israel and to say what they are doing is not necessarily anti-Jewish. I think we have to be able to afford ourselves that kind of common grace before we're ever able to see two parties come together and form any kind of peace, which I think ultimately is what most people, regardless of where you come from in this conversation, would like to see. They would like to see people being able to live in peace without worrying about bombs or rockets or violence invading their lives, their community, their families. And so if those conversations are going to happen, it's going to have to be with the understanding that not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Not every criticism of what may be happening in Gaza or the West Bank is anti-Muslim or anti-Arab or anti-Palestinian. And so for me, I think there has to be a better common understanding. And I'm glad that there are folks willing to have that conversation, even though there's massive criticism from both sides of this debate and this conflict when those voices speak up.
Okay. The um the urgency of what's happening in Palestine is so strong. I mean, basically, the way I see it, Israel keeps saying that no, we're not trying to target civilians. We're doing all we can to prevent civilian deaths. But the death toll is over 30,000. That is insane. And now, well, think of it this way. Let's say somebody wantonly and carelessly drives through a highway in order to target one specific person, but they end up taking down a ton of other people along the way. And then their defense in court becomes, oh, well, I didn't mean to take down a lot of other people. Those were just collateral damage deaths. That would be so completely unacceptable. Now, when we're talking about genocide that Israel's doing, it's not enough to just call it out. I feel like there has to be criminal prosecutions in the International Criminal Court of Justice for what's being done. I mean, how do we, as well as just calling it out and calling for peace, I wonder if the time for talking has passed. I wonder if the president of the United States needs to take stronger actions to hold it.
Well, first off, we as a nation, there's already, the UN and the ICC have already called for these things. Now, of course, the United States doesn't recognize the authority of the ICC, so it kind of doesn't work for us to call them out because if we don't even recognize their authority, you know. But for me, it is important to expose what's going on and the death toll. The fact that I think most of the world would rightfully say after October 7th, hey, you have a reasonable action to respond. I think it's the response that's caused the world to be outraged and horrified by what's going on. So many dead innocents from this process. And you're right, collateral damage is just not a reasonable excuse. It's not something to me. It wasn't a reasonable excuse for me when we were drone bombing all over the world and our government was killing so many innocent people. One of the things I think it does, and I think there are many voices within Israel that voice this concern, that what the government of Israel is doing right now is making the world more dangerous for those who live in Israel, for the citizens of Israel. Because when you kill so many innocent people via collateral damage, those are people's sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, mothers and fathers. And if you saw your family killed through an airstrike, I would say your chances of being radicalized against the state of Israel grow exponentially. And it destabilizes the Palestinian people, which further breeds radicalization and allows violence to bubble to the surface. It allows things like Hamas to be created. It destabilizes relations with Arab neighbors. It creates further tensions with them and creates further possibility of creating a hot war with these neighbors. All of those things make it more dangerous to be the average citizen in Israel. And those things are being pushed by the government there. And so, I don't know if we're ever going to see full investigations. Frankly, I'll be real with you. We need to be holding our own house to accord. We need to be holding ourselves to account for that. The United States has certainly committed war crimes.
Yeah.
And yet none of our presidents ever seek justice or have ever seen the inside of a courtroom. So if we're going to be calling for that on Israel, we should be calling for that on our own leaders. Let's be real.
I see. My last question is, what are the biggest problems the country faces that are not being addressed because they're not getting enough attention or people don't know the solutions? What is, so to speak, the emperor is naked type problems that the US is ignoring? Because I feel like a lot of times when I turn on the news, and it's just about Trump said this, Trump said that, Biden said this, and Biden said that. Well, that's like a view of politics where the journalists pushing that think they understand politics, but they only understand the noise of politics. It's like if a mechanic were to say, oh, yeah, I know a lot about cars, but they only know how to honk the horn and turn on the radio. If there's one thing I left out of this interview, an issue that is threatening the well-being of the United States or threatening human rights or threatening lives that we're not talking about?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones that we don't talk about and probably should more is our deficits and debt. It's right there in our faces. If you look at the debt clock, it's staggering to see how fast that grows. And we continue to spend and spend and spend, and we never really address this. We continue to kick the can down the road, and it's just creating more and more of an eventual calamity. And I don't think we talk about it enough, because even Republicans who claim to be about fiscal conservatism and fiscal sanity, all they want to do is cut the taxes. They never want to cut the spending. They want to continue this fiat bubble that we're building and building and building, and this debt crisis that we're creating. And it's the fact that we can't even pass a budget as a government. We cannot pass a budget. We have been passing continuing resolutions, I think, my entire adult life. We never pass true budgets in this country. Our legislature doesn't do anything. That's the other biggest story, is that our Congress is basically ineffective, that they've basically just given up any authority they have in favor of letting the executive branch run everything and letting pass things via executive order, which creates a huge instability in our nation, because then whoever is from the other party that eventually gets elected just does away with all this stuff. They just untie every knot that the other guy created. And so I think we need to return ourselves back to fiscal sanity, to actually realizing that tax cuts are not enough, that spending cuts have to come with that, and in fact, we actually need to be cutting more spending than taxes at this point, because we're just unequal in terms of the distribution there in terms of revenue. But really, over the fact, I think the biggest untold story is that our Congress doesn't do anything.
Wow.
They're so ineffective. They're the biggest do-nothing Congresses. Like they over time, they just do less and less and less. And it's more about throwing mud at each other and fundraising and the power of incumbency and who can grandstand with the best 30-second sound clip on CNN or Fox News. I think that's a real shame to the American people, and that's really where we're headed down a cliff. That's where the movie Idiocracy is going to become, nonfiction in a short amount of time, if we don't insist that we're actually better represented by our legislature. So I think that's the biggest untold things, is the fact that we're heading towards the dead cliff, and that our Congress is too busy fleeing poo at one another to actually worry about it.
I see. Chase Oliver, on behalf of Matt Girardin, the co-host as well, thank you for his research. Thank you for coming on Philosophisn't. I hope it's been a pleasant conversation for you, and I wish you luck.
It's been great. Thank you for having me, and I hope to see you guys again next time our paths cross. And say hello if you're ever in Atlanta when I'm here.
We will. All right. Take care, Chase.
Goodbye.